This video is to explain basic fundamentals about GLAD, Guided Language Acquisition Design. Guided Language Acquisition Design began in the late 1980s in Orange County, California. The purpose of GLAD is to assist or support English learners or students learning language to continue learning content as close to grade level standard as possible as they are learning a new language. GLAD is an instructional framework. The founders of GLAD took effective strategies that they learned in several different trainings and they compiled them. They produced a sequence, a way to roll out instruction so that students understand the content that they're learning, but they also are able to listen, speak, read, and write about their understandings of the content and practice new language with other students. So there are 4 different components of GLAD, and the components, it's important to remember, refer to the integrated GLAD units. GLAD is typically taught when it's infused in the whole program that someone is doing. It's taught in integrated thematic units. When the founders started teaching in this way, the only content that they did not include in the integrated unit for GLAD teaching was math. That's changed a bit now. There have been teachers who've made inroads in utilizing GLAD strategies or GLAD-like strategies to teach math. It is possible to utilize GLAD strategies in isolation, and they are still effective when used in isolation. In districts where you have an adopted reading curriculum, an adopted social studies curriculum, and a separate adopted science curriculum, GLAD can be used to find commonalities and overlapping areas in the different curriculums, so that students don't need to learn a new set of vocabulary and content information for each part of the day, for each subject area. But it is important to note that we can also utilize GLAD strategies in isolation, and they are effective. If we're designing a GLAD unit, then we design it around 4 different components, but we also design individual days lessons around the same 4 components. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Typically, a GLAD unit will run 1 month to 6 weeks, and at the beginning of the unit, the first component is focus and motivation. The purpose of focus and motivation is to access students' prior knowledge. It is to build background knowledge so that they can connect the new information and new words that they're learning with things that they already know, or that they can have a level playing field on which to begin and communicate with each other about their understandings as they build on those understandings throughout the unit. The second component of GLAD, once students are focused on the topic and once they are interested in the topic and they have a little bit of background knowledge on that topic at least, the next component, which is the main time when teachers get a chance to teach new information and new language, is the input component. When we say input, we mean that new, like I said, new content, new language, and we refer to it as comprehensible input. So not just the teacher just telling or showing students and them being passive in that, and us not knowing how much they're understanding, but it's actually the teacher designing that new information and that new language and teaching it in a way that students can make meaning, so it's meaningful for them. Once students have that new information and that new language, the third component is guided oral practice. So the teacher designs and utilizes certain strategies in GLAD, opportunities for students to talk about their understandings with other students. So it's important that it not always be teacher directed, but that also there's ongoing communication happening and negotiating for meaning, and you practicing academic and social language with learning partners, with teams of learners, typically 4 students in each team. So there are GLAD strategies that support that happening. In the guided oral practice or speaking and listening component of GLAD, a key feature is the pair share, which is also called the 10-2. The thought behind that, the idea behind that, is that no one should ever be asked to sit passively for more than 10 minutes and receive information, direct instruction, without having an opportunity to respond and process that information and do that with a partner. That's another time that we see negotiating for meaning. So the rule of thumb is with GLAD, if whatever age the student is, they have that many minutes that they can sustain attention passively. So if we're working with a 5-year-old, then we should only plan to give a mini lesson or some type of direct instruction that is teacher directed for 5 minutes, and then we should give them at least 1 minute to turn to their partner, their pair, and talk about and respond to what they've just learned. Component number 4, ideally now that students have gone through these other 3 initial GLAD components, they will be more prepared than ever to read and write at grade level content standard. Many students, English learners, as well as students who may struggle in school, may not be able to read and write at grade level content standard unless they go through those 3 components of GLAD and those other activities which prepare them to do that. So for many of our students, they may not require those 3 initial components. They may be able to read and write at grade level independently. They may be prepared to do that. But roughly half of our students probably do need additional preparation and scaffolding and support in order to be able to do that. So that's what GLAD asserts, that that's the case, that it is important to provide all of those different components and build up to that reading and writing at grade level. GLAD seeks to empower students around their own learning. So a couple of things that they do to do that are part of the classroom management, the social emotional learning aspect of GLAD. One of them is classroom observers, which GLAD also calls scouts. In any whole group lesson, there are typically 2 scouts or observers that a teacher selects, and those observers typically watch for students in the class who are showing respect, making good decisions, and solving problems. Those standards are GLAD standards, but I've utilized the standards, the PBIS standards, from the school buildings where I work instead of using the GLAD standards, and it works just as effectively. As the teacher is teaching with GLAD, oftentimes the teacher has the back turned, maybe sketching on charts, adding students' contributions that they say onto graphic organizers. So those observers really help to give another layer there of recognition to students who are engaging in the lesson and who are showing scholarly behavior and making scholarly choices. So after approximately a 10-minute segment of instruction, the teacher will pause and ask the scouts to recognize students who have done those things, have met those standards, and those students will recognize their peers and they will give evidence, justification for why those peers deserve recognition. And typically they will get some type of little paper that might have a visual or a fact, some kind of like a tangible recognition from the scout. Some teachers do decide to give little tokens of appreciation to students or prizes during that phase, but that is completely optional. And the recognition can just possibly be verbal with no tangible anything that goes to the hand of the person recognized. I've also found that the observers themselves really like to have that same recognition given to them when they take on that task. But that's the GLAD way of reinforcing the choices that students are making to help one another learn and make the learning environment optimal. For the group instruction, when we're doing centers, or when we're doing reading groups and students are working in teams or independently, GLAD has a team points component. I've utilized team points a lot. When I am a classroom teacher, I rely heavily on that. So students receive team points for engaging in the social skill of focus for that time period, for that unit, or for that month. And GLAD utilizes a T-chart method to unpack with students what a social skill sounds like and looks like, and the types of things that people will say when they're practicing that social skill. So for example, one of the very first social skills that teachers often launch in the fall when school starts is active listening. What does active listening look like and sound like? And what are some examples of active listening, and what are some things that people might say and do if they're actively listening? So oftentimes we'll talk about nodding our head, making eye contact with the person who is speaking, asking them to clarify things, paraphrasing back what they said. So things like that, where students will understand what it really means to actively listen. And then as they practice that social skill throughout the month, their team can receive points for doing that. The teams also receive points when they play games in GLAD. For example, there's a game in the listening and that guided oral practice, which I also sometimes refer to as listening and speaking component, the third component of GLAD. When students are practicing articulating their understanding about what they've been learning, there's a game called the Process Grid game. And when we play that game and teams give answers, teams can earn points for giving answers for that game. Another important philosophy of GLAD is that we begin our instructional unit with the big picture for students. So we begin with a world map, or we begin with a timeline with visuals. So that we begin with a concept map. So those of us who teach using the Reach for Reading materials, every unit begins with a graphic organizer with a concept map, and it gives students and it begins with a big question. So that is aligned with the philosophy of GLAD that we give, and that background building video also aligns with GLAD in the focus and motivation component of giving students a little bit of background knowledge about what they're about to learn about, and piquing their interest and focusing their attention on that topic. So I've adapted some of the Reach for Reading concept maps that they have in the teacher materials with visuals, and added more of the vocabulary words to them to gladify them and make them more aligned with GLAD. But the idea is the same. Start with an overview, start with the big picture, and then throughout the unit go in more and more specifically, become more focused on more details and add more detail. In GLAD, the teacher begins the unit being leading and guiding everyone. So the teacher is directing and modeling what's happening initially. And then by the time we get to the guided oral practice, the component 3 in the GLAD unit, it's a balance between the teacher guiding things and directing things, and the students taking more responsibility. And then by the end, when we get to the reading and writing piece, and the students are writing independent pieces and doing independent work, then that is towards the end of the unit, because the philosophy is that the students by that point are ready. They have the knowledge and the language that they need to really show what they understand. Those are just some basic principles of GLAD that people who may not ever have had an opportunity yet to take any other GLAD training should know. And another thing that's important to note is that within the daily lesson, It is also, GLAD also recommends that teachers utilize the 4 different components of GLAD within that one lesson. So the beginning of the lesson will provide some type of a focus and motivation piece to remind students of the topic that we're learning and capture their attention and access their prior knowledge about what came previously. The second component of the lesson of the day will be some type of an input knowledge where the teacher is sharing some type of new information or language with the student. Later in the GLAD unit, it would be very brief because they would have already gotten a lot of new information earlier in the unit, but there can still be a review of some of that information or adding a few more details to that. And that could also be student directed. Students could find new information online, and together they could add more information to some of the class charts that have already been presented earlier in the unit. There should also be always some kind of guided oral practice, some kind of practice that students are doing with listening and speaking in any lesson, no matter where it happens in the unit of GLAD. Now, again, if it happens early in the unit, then it may be a brief or very, very teacher directed with lots of sentence frames and stems, lots of repetition. That might happen towards the beginning of the unit because students are not capable yet of, or not ready yet to engage in a lot of independent talk with others about that new topic. Using the new language. But as the unit goes on, that piece should be released more and more to the students as they get more and more prepared for that. And then every lesson, no matter what, should always include some amount of reading and writing, whether that is students responding on whiteboards and showing them, whether they are sketching, and that's their form of writing for the day because that's what they're prepared to do that day, and possibly labeling with a few words, whether they're copying a chart that the teacher did, or whether it's towards the end of the unit and they're writing a paragraph, or they're writing sentences, or they're writing even a multi-paragraph essay, depending on their language level or their age. So these are just some things that are important to note about GLAD as an overview, as a philosophy, as a way of teaching.